We had two huge speeches this week from very senior military security personnel, one from the new head of MI6, the other from the chief of the defence staff, and taken together, they rather seem to be an attempt to publicly recalibrate the country's thinking about the very serious and growing threat from Russia, to prepare us for a future war, and even to take the fight to Russia itself. First up was MI6's Blaise Metrovelli.
I'm going to break with tradition, and I won't give you a global threat tour, but I will focus here on Putin's Russia. We all continue to face the menace of an aggressive, expansionist and revisionist Russia seeking to subjugate Ukraine and harass NATO. I find it harrowing that hundreds of thousands have died, with the toll mounting every day because of Putin's historical distortions and his compromised desire for respect.
A few hours later, it was Air Chief Marshal Richard Knighton's turn, the Chief Defence Staff.
The UK is subject to an onslaught of cyber attacks from Russia. And we know that Russian agents are seeking to conduct sabotage and have killed on our shores. But Russia's hard power is growing quickly.
It's almost like the MOD are listening to our podcast. What is really going on here? Welcome to The General and the Journalist. I'm Tom.
And I'm Patrick. So, Tom, as you say, two big speeches. Very unusual to have a speech from the CDS, which, of course, is always planned. You have this Christmas address, this lecture that the CDS does every year at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. But to get the head of MI6 and the CDS giving a speech on the same day feels odd. I mean, what's going on? Is it coordinated or I don't know? You tell me. You were a lobby journalist.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's also like they really did listen to your plea last week, Patrick, where you very painfully said, we need to hear more from senior military people, senior security people. The government are gagging them, and we can't ever get to the truth and change the country's thinking unless they speak out. And lo and behold, it is really interesting. I guess it's one of two things. It's probably both. They want to speak. Blaise Metrovelli is the first female C. She's been in the job since October. A big appointment that's caused a lot of public interest. It's the first time we've ever heard from her. She wanted to introduce herself. And the Chief Defence Staff always makes a speech to RUSI, the big military think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, just before Christmas. So why on the same day? I guess because the government's thinking, well, we've got to get them out there. Let's just pump it out all on the same day so it doesn't drag on. We could have big impact on the points they're trying to make really interesting, but we won't drag it into a second, third, fourth day, which will then perhaps pose some questions of us and precisely how much money we're spending. So I guess it's to accommodate everybody's hopes, perhaps.
So cram it into one day so that it doesn't drag out over weeks, which is slightly at odds with what we were hoping for, which is to begin to provoke an ongoing dialogue. But I guess we should be grateful that we've had both of those speeches. And of course, I would love to give you and I credit for this, but of course the reality is that these speeches will have been pored over by a fine-tooth comb, by special advisors, by the comms department in the MOD, in the Foreign Office, in SIS, and then finally in Number 10 for weeks and weeks at a time. And I've gone through that painful process myself, so I suspect it's not been a sort of spontaneous reaction to what we were saying last week.
It might not, might be. But glass half full, Patrick, because you did ask for this, and both speeches were really pretty interesting, actually. Your old mate, Richard Knighton, he was a chief with you. Let's talk about that one first, because he really broke some quite interesting new ground. What's your big takes on his speech?
It was a big change in tone from his predecessor, Tony Radakin. Tony, who I served with for, 5 years as a fellow chief, and have an enormous amount of respect and affection for. Tony had this philosophical view that his job was to reassure the country. And so he was never going to say, we're not safe. His message was fundamentally, we are safe, because he felt that was what he needed to say. Whereas what Rich has done is to say, no, we're not. We're in danger, and we're not ready. That line in his speech, peace, we've lived through an era where peace was stable, where conflict was distant, but that is no longer true. Now, what he's not trying to do is to shock. He said that, But equally, he has firmly aligned himself with the French Chief of Defence, who we were talking about last week, who talked quite controversially to a gathering of French mayors about the need for the French nation to be prepared to sacrifice their children. And Rich uses similar language. He talks about sons and daughters. He talks about sacrifice being back. So that was the big thing for me. It was this change of tone.
I think it's just worth dwelling on precisely what he said there, actually, because it really was interesting. Remember, the French Chief of Defence Staff got into terrible trouble for effectively saying France needs to be prepared to give up its children again. But there was Rich Knighton saying something almost similar, and the quotes were, sons and daughters, colleagues, veterans will all have a part to play, and if necessary, to fight, and more families will know what sacrifice for our nation means. That's quite bold words for a British CDS, isn't it? I mean, maybe it shouldn't be, but it's certainly out of the norm. And I can certainly see number 10 cringing a little bit on that phrase.
Yeah. So point one, it's a big change in tone. And to justify that, to try to explain, he gets into this, he tries to explain what the threat is. And he doesn't talk about it in generic sort of hypothetical terms. He draws on statistics. So he says, yes, the threat of a direct Russian attack on the UK is remote. But that remote probability is the same probability as Liverpool winning the league, which I thought was a sort of helpful anecdote, a little vignette, just to make people alive, to try to puncture this complacency that we were talking about last week. So the thing that I think Rich has done, which I really admire and celebrate, is he's had the courage to begin a conversation that was called for in the SDR. This notion of having a national debate, the fact that you can't outsource defence and security to a series of bespoke niche institutions like SIS, like the armed forces. It's a national responsibility. You know, in some ways, it's a sort of call to be more Nordic. You know, we've admired for a long time how Sweden, how Norway, how Finland approaches this, and that debate that he is now trying to catalyse, trying to contribute to play a part in, is of course long overdue. You know, the SDR came out 9 months ago, and we've had total silence. When we talked about this last week. And what worries me is a statistic that I think we've all seen, which is that, you know, when polled, only 37% of the UK said that they would fight for their country. Now, as we know from the discussion last week, that was also true of the pre-Second World War generation. But what we haven't seen is meat behind the bones of Keir Starmer's pledge to make defence the central organising principle of government. So the big takeaway for me was Rich standing up as the CDS and really standing up and saying, no, it's not just about investing in the armed forces. This is we all have to play a part.
His phrase was the whole of society approach, wasn't it? And your speech of a couple of years ago, because you've been saying this for an awful long time, Patrick, in office and out of it, was a citizens' army, which is a very similar sort of concept. But just remind us, I know because I've heard you say it a few times, so just to remind everyone, why do you care so passionately having this whole of society approach, a citizens' army? Why does it matter?
Because it's nations that fight wars, not armies, air forces, or navies. And what we've seen, you know, the reason that Ukraine has survived through the last 4 horrendous years is because they've mobilized the whole of society. And we can't sit on our island thinking that these threats aren't going to come our way. You know, Blaise, and we're going to talk about her speech later on, Blaise made exactly the same point. We are all on the front line. And none of us want to fight a war. The point is to avoid war. It's to deter war. But the only way that you deter war is by demonstrating that you not only have the military capabilities to make it very, very hard for an adversary, let's call it out, Russia, to achieve its objectives, but that you can sustain that effort, that your society is prepared to commit the will, and of course it's will ultimately that secures nations' futures.
You now think there might be some sort of need for, albeit a limited form of national service, mandatory service, once you prepared society for that sort of war mindset. Rich Knighton was asked in the Q&A by pesky defence journalists in the room last night, what his thoughts were on the need for that for national service. He said, no, that's not the British way. So you didn't get everything last night, Patrick, but you'll probably take it.
No, but you'll remember that last week I talked about, the very first thing we should do is to begin to take a whole of government, a whole of society approach to the national resilience, and then have a conversation about whether or not conscription and national service is necessary. For what it's worth, I still think that our senior defence leadership are being a little bit flippant and dismissive about beginning to grow or use national service as a tool as part of this. And I think Rich was guilty of that last night as well. But I realise that it's politically difficult and unthinkable at the moment.
Well, then, Patrick, we have the speech by Blaise Metrovelli, her first as the new chief of MI6, the first female chief, the first ever C. And it followed broadly the same subject as Knighton's, the Russia threat. Some familiar territory from a chief of MI6, but some far less so. First off, here's a little bit about Blaise. She went to Cheltenham Ladies' College, a very smart girls' school in the west of England. She went on to study anthropology at Public College, Cambridge, and then later psychology and AI, artificial intelligence. So she's super academic. Joined the Secret Intelligence Service as a case officer, so a young intelligence officer in 1999. And her career's been fascinating in what we know of it so far, and very little has been released, obviously, just the bits that she cares to put out into the public domain. And she put a bit more out yesterday. She said she was operational to her very core. She spent nearly 3 decades recruiting, running agents in hostile territory, leading operations in war zones.
Over the years, I've worked with hundreds of brilliant partners, and indeed occasionally those we'd label as adversaries across dozens of countries, tackling weapons proliferation and terrorism.
So she's a proper intelligence officer, if you like. She had a long secondment to MI5 at a very senior level, a director level, to learn obviously about counter-terrorism in the UK and countering threats on her home shores. And then her last job before this one was as Q. And actually, there is a Q in MI6. It's not just in the Bond films. It's actually a brand new invention. They took it from the Bond films, but she was the first ever Q effectively in charge of tech and gadgetry. And then appointed a C to follow on from Sir Richard Moore at the quite young age of 48, Patrick, which is pretty young age for a C, for a chief, normally in their sort of 50s, late 50s. And you know her personally. You've served and worked alongside her.
I do. I never served with Blaise overseas, or not to my knowledge. But we spent a lot of time rubbing shoulders with each other in Cobra and committee rooms, and all the places that securocrats congregate in Whitehall. So I know her reasonably well, and I mean she's very impressive. She's an operator, and the office, as they describe themselves, that's important to them because that's what their identity is all about. She's a team player, so someone who's trustworthy, who doesn't have an ego, doesn't undermine people in other government departments. She's open. I mean, very, very easy to talk to. She's curious. She's unconventional. And then, of course, she has got this thing that SIS does. So if you remember the Disney version of The Jungle Book.
I do.
Do you remember the snake, Car?
I do.
Do you remember the song?
The villain.
Trust in me. And he has the eyes that go around. So all of the best SIS operators.
I was wondering where you're going with this, but go on.
All of the best MI6 operators I know have this ability to win you over. Because they deal with human intelligence. They have to be able to win people over. And so you find yourself subconsciously being just steered, being manipulated.
And that's the essential skill of the job.
Yeah.
You are trying to win round, trying to get people to trust
So
you.
those are the fundamentals of the job. But she's now stepped up to a wholly different role, which is not only to lead an intelligence service, but to lead an institution and to make sure that institution fosters and flourishes within the intelligence community, and to see off the threats to the UK. And that's where she went with her speech. So you Tom, you've watched, you've listened to the speech. What did you take away from it?
Well, location, I think, is the first point of interest. So this was actually, and you can see some of the pictures on the TV, on social media, etc. This was the first ever public speech from inside the MI6 building itself, which is that, as everyone will know, the great big green and yellow, modern-looking building just by Vauxhall Bridge at
Yellow?
Vauxhall Cross.
Yellow?
Sandstone,
I'm not sure there's any yellow.
perhaps. So green and sandstone building by Vauxhall Cross. No one has ever seen inside that building before. In fact,
Well, I have.
well, I have too.
Well, there you go.
But I've been in the boardroom as well. But anyway, hopefully we'll cut this bit because it's very dull to the poor old listeners. But there she was giving this speech inside MI6 in her own boardroom, where she also hosts lunches and meets people. And that was the thing itself. And that was done pointedly, because this was all about us continuing to open up. So MI6 is the least open of the three intelligence agencies, MI5 and GCHQ, the other two, for good reason, because their business is human intelligence, people meeting other people and spying. And it's difficult to be too open when it's all about faces and names and recognition. But it was a big move to do that, and she promised more openness during her speech. Didn't take any questions, though, Patrick. That would have been a real act of openness, but it was a pretty impressive performance all in from what we saw.
What were your main takeaways from within the speech itself, Tom?
Well, there's some really interesting new stuff in there, absolutely fascinating stuff, I thought. The first bit was this real declaration from her, and I have never heard this construction before, of the sort of state we're in. She said, we're between war and peace. We're not at war, we're also not at peace. We're in that affected grey zone that we know Russia's been operating in for a good decade or more now, below the line of kinetic warfare of shooting things at each other, but in the age and the aura of disruption and real causing your rival states, your enemy states, real difficulties. That's the Russian doctrine of sort of grey zone warfare. And she declared that's exactly where we are. And there were two other bits that were completely engrossing. One was what she said MI6 are going to do about this, how they're going to counter this ever-increasing malicious Russian threat, the destabilizing Russian threat, whether it's on our democracy, which the Prime Minister has announced an inquiry into this week after the reform leader of Wales, Nathan Gill, was convicted, how Russia is trying to subvert our democracy, to burning down warehouses, to flying drones into our allies' airspaces over Europe. And she pretty much announced MI6 were going to step up, or she said it so publicly anyway. And her line on this was absolutely fascinating. She called into play the Special Operations Executive, the 1940 established, brilliant, very secret operation of spies and operators who go behind Nazi lines, cause terrible trouble and blow things up. And this is what she said.
At an operational level, we will sharpen our edge and impact with audacity, tapping into, if you like, our historical SOE instincts.
And she went on to say, we're going to take calculated risks where the price is significant and the national interest clear, but we'll never stoop to the tactics of our opponents. So we must seek to outplay them, is what she said. What did you think of that, calling into play the SOE, and what exactly that means in practice? What sort of things are MI6 now going to go on and do?
So I suspect she's not the first C to evoke the SOE as an inspiration for the service. But it's interesting that she found it necessary to do so now. And I think that the language she uses, talking about audacity, is almost trying to encourage the sort of buccaneering spirit of her service that I don't think we've seen for a while. I think she is trying to breathe confidence, to encourage edge back into SIS as a response to the threat that we're seeing, and when we talk about Russia, the threat that we're seeing from the FSB, but in particular the GRU, who are, who sometimes behave like true cowboys. So she's tempered. She's talked about audacity. She's talked about edge. She's trying to give confidence back to the service, and I think that will be incredibly welcome amongst all of the operators and the officers that we have in that service. But she's tempered it, as she rightly should, but we're going to do it in accordance and respecting our own values and what it is that makes us strong. And she talks in the speech at one point about speaking to an agent that she'd handled, who, when she asked why this agent had had put him or herself in harm's way and had supported the UK, he or she answered, "It's about your values. It's about what you represent. It's the integrity and respect." And there are very strong echoes of, in many ways, SIS's finest hour, Oleg Gordievsky. And when Gordievsky was recruited, probably the most important agent that any service has run, any foreign service has run in those days in the Soviet Union, Gordievsky did it because he was repelled by what the Soviet Union were doing, and he was attracted to the values, the integrity, and the respect that he saw in the UK.
Recently, I had the privilege of meeting and thanking a foreign agent who has worked with us for decades, taking extraordinary risks to help keep the UK safe. I asked why, and they said simply, "Your values, your integrity and respect. None of us have a future without them." This moment reinforced to me that we must remain a very human agency.
So she's drawing on two historical parallels. One, that edginess, that buccaneering spirit, that audacity that the SOE did, and then she's also making sure that we don't lose our values.
I guess the question is, Patrick, if you want to inspire your service to go on and commit ever greater acts of daring do as the SOE led before us, you can do that in a private speech. You can send that in an email. You can do that in the auditorium inside SIS with all your people. Why is she saying it in public, though?
Well, I think she's doing it the same reason that Rich Knighton made his, the central message of Rich Knighton's speech. This need to prepare the nation for what we're facing, and actually what we're experiencing at the moment. It's interesting. They had two slightly different subtle approaches. So Rich talks more about, funny enough, he talks much less about the need to invest in the armed forces and the armed forces being the only answer to this. He talks much, much more about a wider societal resilience and the need to prepare the whole of society and to have a national debate. Whereas Blaze's speech is more internally focused. Her speech is, here's how SIS are going to protect you. This is what we are going to do. This is what you should expect from us. This is the service I lead. So there's a slight different tone in their approaches, but I think that the reason she's spoken out is because she sees, as much as Rich and all of us do, the need to begin to cut through the societal complacency that exists in the UK in a way that, as we know, simply doesn't exist in countries that are much more geographically proximate, but also have a sense of history.
It feels to me that sometimes we can get a bit downbeat, can't we? All the warnings of doom and gloom, which, Rich Knighton and Blaise Metrovelli did last night, can depress people a bit. But if you come back and say, hey, guess what? We're in this fight and we're damn good at it, and we're going to get even better at it, and everything they throw at us, we're going to throw back at them better. You won't see it with the Secret Service, with the Quiet Service, she also said last night, but we are going to be there taking the fight to the enemy. So it's almost sort of the same Rich Knighton message, isn't it? Preparing people, but preparing them in a more upbeat, positive way.
Yeah. And I think her message was both external, so we're in danger, but we're here as the UK's premier, or the UK's premier human intelligence agency to protect you. But most importantly, it was to breathe life, confidence, to send a strong electrical impulse down through into the service itself.
The business of human, though, it's worth us dwelling very briefly, as in human intelligence, collecting human intelligence, in other words, getting people to spy for you, to tell you stuff who really shouldn't be doing that and risking life and limb to do that. That is ever harder in a digital age, isn't it? In an age where cameras can see everything, anything you put on an email or a WhatsApp is going to be read, facial recognition technology. It makes old-fashioned spying, as you'd know it, or you might read in John le Carré, exceedingly difficult. But, maybe as the former Q, she's got some good ideas how to go about that.
Yeah, so the tradecraft in a digital age is very much harder. It is almost impossible to vanish in the digital age, to have an alibi, to have a a legend, to be someone that you're not. That is very, very difficult. To move across borders in a way that you're not tracked is extremely difficult. But also, technology makes spying easier in some ways. What's interesting from her speech is she focuses, and I think this is the golden thread that runs through what she was saying, this notion about having agency, about having human agency. Now, I think she meant two things by that. One that you and I would absolutely agree with, and I talk about all the time, which is, yes, we are in a very, very dangerous era, but we still have agency. We can choose. We can make decisions. It doesn't have to. We don't have to. We don't have to accept decline as being the inevitable outcome of where we are. We can stand up to Russia. We can deter them. We can contribute to the restoration of an international order that respects the sort of values that we've been lucky enough to grow up with. But the second part of what she meant by human agency was a sort of subtle message, which is to remind everybody that this is what SIS does. This is their USP. They are a human intelligence agency.
In an age of uncertainty, one constant remains. The choices made by human beings still determine the shape of the world. Yes, technology can illuminate possibilities, but information requires judgment. Complexity demands clarity, and only people can decide which path to follow.
So in an era where it's very tempting to assume that you can draw all of your intelligence through technical means, whether that's open source intelligence, just using AI to suck up data, whether that's intelligence from space, whether that's communications intelligence, electronic warfare intelligence, whether it's what GCHQ does. What she's doing is sending, and she would say this, wouldn't she, as the head of a human intelligence agency, you cannot, all of those things will be true, but what human intelligence does is gives you insights and fills gaps in the way that no other forms of intelligence collection can do. So she was making a subtle point as well.
A subtle plea for MI6 in the 21st century. And we're not just a 20th century Le Carre Cold War thing.
And she's responsible for her service in the institution, and she wants it to flourish, and we all do.
Closing thoughts then, Patrick. As we end this extraordinary week of speeches, does it feel we're in a different place to you now than we were maybe this time last week?
So I don't think the world is in a different place, but I do think that at last we've seen the government begin to remove the muzzle from some of the most important voices in a debate that has to be happening, because it would be irresponsible not to. And I congratulate Blaise and Rich Knighton on what they've done, because they've been important interventions.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Now, let's see the money.
Well, that's all for this week. Before we go, there's still time to vote for the General and the Journalist in the Political Podcast Awards 2026. We're nominated for Best Newcomer. We'll put a link in the show notes with a block on voting for anyone else. And as always, please send your questions and comments our way. The email is generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk, generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. And if I may, I'm going to plug Tom's newsletter, which is called War and Peace, and it covers geopolitics and conflicts, and it'll drop in your inboxes every Thursday. It is a brilliant read, and I read it not just from loyalty to Tom, but because it's really good. Until next week, bye, Tom.
You are very kind, Patrick. Merry Christmas and goodbye.